Somewhere in Todd McFarlane's archive, there is a finished 90-minute animated Spawn movie that almost nobody has ever seen. Not a pitch, not a rough cut, an honest-to-God finished project, fully drawn from front to back, with every single line of dialogue already recorded. Keith David is back in the role that made him a legend to a whole generation of fans, and Mark Hamill is in there too, voicing Twitch. This thing has apparently been sitting untouched for years, and McFarlane only brought it up publicly at San Diego Comic-Con 2026, almost as a footnote, while most of the room was really there to grill him about the long-suffering live-action reboot. Honestly, that pretty much sums up where Spawn stands right now as a franchise. Every few weeks, there's another surprise buried underneath a decade of delays on the project everybody actually expected. Before we get into all of that, quick refresher for anyone who only half remembers this character from a 90s Halloween costume. Al Simmons is a former Black Ops soldier who gets betrayed and murdered by his own handler, a man named Jason Wynn, and then cuts a deal in hell with a demon called Malebolgia just to get one more chance to see his wife Wanda. He comes back wearing this living, organic suit made of something called necroplasm, complete with a cape that basically has its own personality and its own agenda, only to discover his face is ruined and years have already passed, and Wanda has since remarried his own best friend. That betrayal is the actual emotional engine of the whole franchise. Spawn isn't a noble hero saving the world, he's a weapon built by hell trying to figure out if there's any humanity left worth saving in himself. It plays a lot more like a tragedy wearing a monster suit than a typical superhero story, and that's exactly why a studio like Blumhouse, built on smart mid-budget horror instead of 4-quadrant tentpoles, actually makes sense as the home for this instead of a traditional studio chasing a Marvel-style blockbuster. And the character's track record backs that up. McFarlane literally co-founded Image Comics back in 1992 just so he could own Spawn outright, and issue 1 reportedly sold somewhere around 1.7 million copies, an absurd number for an independent book with zero corporate machine pushing it. It became an Emmy-winning HBO animated series by the late 90s that's still considered one of the best comic adaptations ever put to screen. Niche as it remains. There was also a 1997 live-action movie from New Line starring Michael Jai White that made roughly double its budget back at the box office, yet still got shredded by critics, landing around 17% on Rotten Tomatoes. That movie has hung over every reboot conversation since, half cautionary tale, half proof that there's still real commercial appetite for this character if somebody finally nails the execution. Back to that shelved animated film for a second, because the details are genuinely strange. By McFarlane's account, the whole 90-minute movie has already been drawn, the voice cast is fully locked, and what's actually missing is the cell work to render those drawings into finished animation, some Foley work for sound design, and a studio willing to take everything that already exists and physically assemble it. His plan, at least as he's described it, is to sit on this finished project until the live-action movie comes out first, so that if the reboot lands well, he can follow it almost immediately with something fans have wanted for years without waiting through another 5-year production cycle. He also apparently had to push Hamill to use his own natural voice for Twitch rather than leaning into the more theatrical, cartoonish delivery Hamill is known for from his other animated work. Smart sequencing on paper. In practice, it just means a nearly finished movie keeps sitting in a drawer. Nobody's even totally sure when this was recorded. McFarlane's own comments suggest it happened very early in Hamill's voice acting career, which would line up with right after his Joker performance on Batman the Animated Series made him a household name, years before Keith David ever picked up the role for HBO's Spawn series in the late 90s. The more likely explanation floating around fan circles is that this footage actually comes from McFarlane's attempt at a follow-up animated series in the mid-2000s meant to continue that HBO continuity, a project that got quietly shelved with no real explanation at the time. McFarlane has since said that fell apart over creative friction with the studios attached, which is part of why he eventually bought the rights back outright. Since HBO used to chop full seasons into 2-hour movies for VHS and DVD releases, there's a decent chance this 90-minute cut is either a compressed premiere or leftover material from that abandoned continuation rather than something built from scratch. Now here's the part that's genuinely been a running joke in movie circles for the better part of a decade, the live-action reboot itself, sometimes still referred to as King Spawn, even though McFarlane insists that's just a working title with no real connection to the 2021 comic run of the same name. This thing has been parked at Blumhouse since 2017. McFarlane started talking publicly about a reboot back around 2009, staying fairly quiet out of respect for how badly the original film had landed with comic fans. By 2016, he'd written his own script and wanted to direct it himself despite having zero filmmaking experience. And his original pitch is honestly kind of fascinating in hindsight, a low-budget noir-style horror movie where Spawn barely appears, functioning more like a paranormal force lurking behind behind a story actually centered on two detectives, Twitch Williams and Sam Burke, investigating a string of murders. He described the tone as something closer to Jaws or Seven, where the title character is felt far more than he's actually seen. Renner signed on in 2018 to play Twitch, and that same year Foxx, who'd reportedly been publicly campaigning for the role since around 2013, officially joined as Al Simmons, with Blumhouse having boarded the project the year before. And then it just sat there for years, dragging through industry strikes, a pandemic, multiple script overhauls, and a steady stream of online mockery. By 2022, a fresh writing team came in. Scott Silver of Joker, Malcolm Spellman of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and a third writer named Matt Mixon, and that lineup alone signaled a pivot away from McFarlane's original scrappy detective concept towards something with a lot more scale. The next real milestone landed in July 2024, when Blum and McFarlane posted a photo of an actual script title page reading King Spawn. For a project that had turned into something of an industry punchline, a physical script cover felt like genuine proof of life. At that year's Comic-Con, McFarlane clarified that the title was likely just a placeholder rather than the final choice, and more importantly, that it isn't meant as a direct adaptation of the 2021 comic series sharing its name. His reasoning came down mostly to marketing, since hearing the plain word Spawn tends to make audiences immediately think back to the 1997 movie. So a different title helps signal a clean break, even if the actual connection to that comic run ends up being in name only. Which is a shame in one sense, because the King Spawn comic itself, written by Sean Lewis alongside McFarlane with art by Javier Fernandez, has a genuinely tight, nasty little plot that would translate beautifully to screen. Classic villain Billy Kincaid, a literal child-killing demon from the earliest issues, escapes back to Earth and teams up with Jason Wynn, Simmons' own murderer, forming a cult called Psalms 137 with one single goal: manipulating Simmons into willingly climbing onto an actual throne in hell to fulfill an old prophecy, since a Spawn who takes that crown on his own becomes far easier to control than one who keeps refusing power. It's really a story about whether accepting power your enemies built specifically for you could ever count as a real victory. Even if the movie never lifts that plot directly, there's a decent chance some of that throne and prophecy imagery survives in spirit, since it hands a film instant cosmic stakes without needing 2 hours of slow setup. Moving into 2025, McFarlane's own tone got noticeably more cautious. In a February interview, he admitted there'd been essentially zero forward movement on actual filming, floating a Halloween-adjacent 2026 release as a best-case scenario while immediately hedging that even that could slip further. Then in July, at that year's Comic-Con, he delivered probably the single most concrete update of the entire saga, revealing that a contract had gone out the previous week to a director he described as genuinely A-list, someone multiple industry people reportedly reacted to with real excitement once the name came up internally. His new strategy, rather than announcing every hire the second it happens like he's impulsively done before, is to hold everything back and reveal the director, the financing partner, and probably the cast all together in one coordinated drop, partly to reclaim the narrative after years of incremental disappointment. He also described a budget bigger than a typical Blumhouse horror film, but explicitly nowhere near $200 million, which lines up with his repeated comparisons to the bleak, grounded tone of Joker rather than the louder, joke-heavy energy of Deadpool and Wolverine. That comparison genuinely cuts both ways as a business argument, since Deadpool proved an R-rated comic movie can cross $1 billion worldwide, while the original Joker proved the exact same thing off a tiny $65 million budget back in 2019. By August of 2025, outlets covering the project were still describing it as largely stuck behind the scenes, even as McFarlane kept insisting real progress was happening that just hadn't gone public yet. Which brings us to the most recent update from this year's Comic-Con just a few days ago, and it's actually the most candid McFarlane has been about the delays in years. He openly admitted that he himself has been the real bottleneck, rejecting draft after draft because none of them hit the specific tone he's chasing, something dark and ugly and genuinely unsettling rather than just edgy for the sake of it. His point wasn't that the writers lack talent, more that his own shifting standards keep moving the target, and he's now looking specifically for people willing to build inside that particular vision instead of pitching something safer around it. What's genuinely new is the reasoning behind why he now thinks that tone is commercially viable, pointing to the surprise success of small effects light horror hits like Obsession, Backrooms, and Leviticus as proof that Spawn doesn't need giant set pieces or city leveling fights to feel powerful on screen. His argument is essentially that Spawn's whole appeal is being a character who can go to places Captain America or Superman simply never could, seriously dark rather than just Dark Knight dark, and that leaning fully into that instead of chasing a conventional blockbuster might be exactly what what finally gets this thing unstuck after 9 years of false starts. That pitch honestly tracks. A lean, character-driven horror movie plays directly to what Blumhouse already does well, instead of fighting against it, and it matches the tonal DNA of the comic far better than anything shaped like a conventional superhero tentpole ever could.